So I'll try not to take too much of your time. I know Vespers finished a little later today. So the last couple of days, we've been celebrating Saint Mary in the church with the venerations during Vespers and from the talks that we've heard the last couple of days. So today it'll be a bit of a change of pace. We'll talk about the Transfiguration. So today the church, it celebrated the Feast of the Transfiguration, and it's one of the 7 minor feasts of our church. So it always comes 3 days before the Feast of St. Mary, which is going to be this Thursday. So it's one of those feasts that always lie during fasting days, okay? So we all know the story of the transfiguration of Jesus on the mountain. We've heard it yesterday in the gospel during Vespers and again today during the liturgy. But I'll very quickly recap the story and then we can dive a little deeper. So first of all, what's the definition of the word transfiguration? So transfiguration, it's a change in form or appearance. And if we take it a little extra step further, what type of change? It's an exalting, glorifying, or spiritual change. So I just want you to keep that definition in mind for later. Okay, quick recap on the story. So Jesus took Peter, James, and John up to a mountain, and some of the early church fathers, such as St. Cyril, they identified this mountain as Mount Tabor, which is in modern-day northern Israel. So people till this day, they still go visit that mountain. So on the mountain, Jesus started praying, and as he prayed, the appearance of his face was altered, and his robe became white and glistening, and behold, 2 men talked with him, who were Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his decease, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. So here they're talking about his journey to the cross and then ultimately his death by crucifixion. So the story actually keeps going for a couple more verses in the Gospel of Luke, but I just wanted to focus on these 2 verses. So even though the story of the Transfiguration, it's only a couple of verses in the Gospel of Luke, but there's actually quite a few things to unwrap here, and I'll summarize them in 3 main points. So the first one, we'll talk about the 3 disciples. The second one, we'll talk about the actual transfiguration of Christ on the mountain. And then finally, we'll talk about Moses and Elijah. So first point, we'll talk about the 3 disciples. So before we talk about why these 3 disciples were specifically chosen by Christ in this event, let's talk about the number 3. So why did Jesus take 3 disciples? Why did he not decide to take just 1 disciple? So in old Jewish law, for there to be a lawful witness, there had to be 2 or more people in the situation. If there was just 1 person, they wouldn't take your word for it, okay? So if we go back to the Old Testament in the book of Deuteronomy, it says, "Whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness." So here we see the importance of having more than 1 witness, okay? If we look at another example in the New Testament, in the 2nd letter to the Corinthians, it says, "By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word shall be established." So again, the importance of having more than 1 witness. So when we hear the story of the Transfiguration and we see that Christ took 3 disciples with him, we don't really think too much of it, okay? It's just a simple fact. But if you think about it, if Jesus had taken just 1 disciple, and this disciple saw this event of the Transfiguration on the mountain, and then he comes back down, talks to the disciples, tells them what he's seen, they probably wouldn't have taken his word for it, okay? So if we go back into the 2nd verse, "By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word shall be established." So it's a simple fact, but it's very significant here, okay? Okay, so that's the significance of the number 3. So now let's look at why did Jesus choose Peter, James, and John. So there was a scholar and theologian in the school of Alexandria, and this is back in 250 AD, and he says that his name was Origen, and he says that they alone were capable of beholding his glory on that occasion and seeing the glorified appearance of Moses and Elijah. So other than the Transfiguration, there are 2 more examples in the Bible where Jesus specifically took these 3 exact same disciples to very specific events, okay? Let's look at what these 2 examples are. So the first one, when Jesus was on his way to raise the daughter of Jairus from the dead, he picked these three disciples. So the Gospel of Mark, it says, he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Okay? The second example is when he singled them out to be with him during his agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. So again, Gospel of Mark, it says, and he took Peter, James, and John with him, and he began to be troubled and deeply distressed. So we see from these three examples that he always takes these three disciples with him, but we still don't know why. So let's look at that. So there was a bishop, his name was Bishop Gregorios. He was a bishop of theological studies, and he further explains or gives his own interpretation as to why Jesus, I don't want to say favored, but chose these three disciples at these very specific events. So let's look at what he said for the three disciples. So Peter, as we all know, he was the eldest disciple, okay? And he was the first disciple to actually proclaim Jesus' divinity. So when Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" What was Peter's answer? "You are Christ, the Son of the living God." And that's why Jesus called Peter blessed, okay? So for James, James was the first disciple to be martyred. Not the first martyr. We know who the first martyr is. Let me see. Right. So James was the first disciple to gain the crown of martyrdom, and it was by the hands of King Herod Agrippa. So just a quick side fact, King Herod Agrippa was the grandson of King Herod the Great, who, when Jesus was born, killed all the male children under 2 in Bethlehem. Okay? And then finally, for John, he says that it's because he personifies purity and chastity, which earned him the special love of Christ. So the Bible doesn't specifically say why these three disciples were chosen, but we see that since he took these three in these very remarkable events, that they were closer or special to Christ. And Christ knew that these three disciples would be the key leaders in the early church, in the early days of the church, and he wanted to prepare them for that role. Okay, so he deliberately took them with him to these three remarkable experiences. So that's the first point. We talked about the three disciples. Number one, the significance of the number three, and why these three specific disciples were chosen. So our second point, let's talk about Christ's actual transfiguration on the mountain and its significance. So if you hear sermons about the transfiguration, a common theme you'll find is that how this scene is being likened to the second coming. Okay? Gospel of Matthew, it says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory." So remember the definition of transfiguration in the beginning, we said that it's a glorifying change. So here the disciples, they only saw a small portion of Christ's glory. He just wanted to give them a small taste of his divinity. Pope Shenouda III, he also likens this scene to the second coming, but in a different way. He says that when Jesus transfigured into this glorified form, he gave human nature a glorified form. As we all know, Christ, God, he took our human nature, he took our human form, and in this instant, he gave it a different, exalting, glorified form. So when are we going to have that glorified form? During the second coming, right? When our bodies are raised from the dead, we'll still have our human bodies, but it will be an exalting and glorified change, okay? So when our body is glorified, it won't be affected by any earthly matter, such as thirst, hunger, disease, pain, any of that stuff. So if you look, we can actually see a quick example in the Old Testament. So for those of you that were in competition this year, which I think is most of you, what was our topic during competition? Daniel and the three holy youth, right? So what's the example there of a transfigured human nature? The three holy youth, right? They were thrown into the fiery furnace. Did anything happen to them in the fiery furnace? Nothing happened to them. So here, they experienced a form of transfiguration of their human nature. They were exalted for a brief moment in time. They were exalted from an earthly matter. And in this example was what? Was the fire. Earthly matter here was the fire. So the only difference was here was only for a brief moment in time. But in heaven, it's going to be for all of eternity. Okay? So at that point in the transfiguration, even though the disciples, they were with Christ during his time, during his ministry, the 3 years of his ministry, and seeing all the miracles that he performed, they still weren't able to fully comprehend his divinity. Okay? So this event actually proved Christ's divinity in two ways. So what are these two ways? The first is the actual transfiguration, the change in his appearance to a glorified form. So Matthew says his face shone like the sun. So can anyone all of a sudden, while they're standing there, all of a sudden have their face shine like the sun? Can they change their body? Can they glorify their body in an instant? Probably not. Okay? So that's the first way. So the second point that proves Christ's divinity was the fact that he was able to summon Moses and Elijah in an instant. Okay? Again, can anyone in any point in time, are they able to summon anyone from throughout history? Probably not. Okay? And these are two people that, like Moses was someone that had died 1,500 years before, and then Elijah was someone who 800 years before went up in a chariot of fire, right? And he was able to summon them in an instant. So these 2 points, they're important to keep in mind that prove Christ's divinity in the scene of the transfiguration. Obviously, there are other examples of proof of Christ's divinity in other situations, but here we're just talking about the transfiguration. One other point that I wanted to add that proves Christ's divinity, which we didn't read in the first slide, which was related to the Gospel of Luke, it was when a cloud came and overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud and said, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." Okay? So these 3 important points that prove Christ's divinity in the scene of the transfiguration. Okay? So now we talked about the first 2 points. We talked about the 3 disciples, the significance of the number 3, why the 3 disciples were chosen. And then second point is we talked about the actual transfiguration of Christ and its significance. Okay? So third and final point is about Moses and Elijah. So why did Christ decide to summon Moses and Elijah? He could have summoned anyone from throughout history, right? He could have summoned Abraham, King David, Esther, make your pick. But there was a reason why he decided to summon Moses and Elijah. So Pope Shenouda III, he says Moses and Elijah, they represent the whole of humanity. Okay, so in what ways? Let's look at a comparison between both in terms of how they lived their lives and in terms of their character traits. So this table here, it shows you some of the differences between both people. So if we look at Moses, so Moses represents the law. If we look at the Old Testament, we know that he received the 10 commandments from God and he passed them down to the people of Israel. Okay, so he represents the law. If we look at Elijah, Elijah was a prophet, so he represents all the prophets in the Old Testament. Okay. Moses was married during his time on earth. He was married, so Moses represents those that are married. Okay. Elijah was a prophet, so he's not married. He lived his life in the desert. Okay. Moses represents those that died, because as I said, 1,500 years before Christ, he died an earthly death. Elijah represents those that did not die, right? Because he didn't die an earthly death. 800 years before Christ, he was carried up in a chariot of fire. So now let's look at a comparison between their character traits. So Moses, he was known for his long suffering and patience. Elijah, on the other hand, he was known for his intensity, his courage, and his strength. So we can see how both of these characters are so different in so many ways. They're different in the way they live their lives, and they're different in even their character traits. But what did they have? They had one thing in common, and what was that? The love of God, okay? And that's what Christ is trying to tell us. Heaven will include everyone, whether you're married, whether you decide not to marry, whether you're patient, whether you're quiet your whole life like St. Mary, whether you're intense and full of fire like Elijah. But the one thing all those in heaven have in common is the love of God. Okay? Another important reason why Moses and Elijah were with Christ If we look at the book of Jude, it says, "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints." So again, this goes back to the point of the scene of the transfiguration being likened to the second coming. So Christ, he'll come with a host of angels and all his saints. So if you look at the scene of the transfiguration, that's why it's being likened to the second coming. And then one final point here, this event, it proves that there's life after death, especially with Moses being there. So again, Moses was someone that died 1,500 years ago, and the disciples, this is someone that they've heard about, that they've read about their whole lives, and again, someone that's died 1,500 years ago, and they can clearly see him right in front of them, okay? So proof of life after death. So I know that was a lot of information. I'm nearly done, trying to keep it a little short. So that was a lot of information, a lot of verses. So if we kind of just take a step back a little bit. So if you see this image, so if you imagine we're standing from afar looking up at the mountain, and then you see the scene of the transfiguration. You have Moses and Elijah on one side who represent the Old Testament, and then you have the disciples on the other side that represent the New Testament. And then who do we have in the middle? We have God. So God, who is the center of time, who brings all these people together in one point in time. So again, Moses, these are two different groups that were in different timelines. Moses is in a timeline 1,500 years before Christ. Elijah was 800 years before, and then the disciples, obviously, during the time of Christ. So all these were together in one point in time. So for us, what does this represent when we look at this scene of the transfiguration? So this is a representation of what heaven is going to be like. You have God in the center, and you have all the angels and all the saints from throughout history will be around him, praising and glorifying him. So finally, may God grant us the transfiguration of our human nature so that we may be with him and join him in heaven with the saints. And glory be to God forever. Amen.
Just want to say a quick thank you to our beloved servant Mario. I love the part about how heaven is going to encompass so many different personalities. I love that part because we all have different personalities, right? Some of us are a little bit more like St. Peter, and we're more what? Everything we think is on our mouth, right? Everything we think we're always going to talk about, we're always going to be a little bold, right? Some of us are like St. John, we're quiet, but we're very loving of Christ. But yet Christ is going to have a place for each one of us. So that was really beautiful. Did you guys have any questions? No? Okay, cool. Let's say our Father. Here, so I'll say thankfully, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those trespassing against us. Lead us not into temptation, deliver us from the evil one. Christ Jesus our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen.